I have two tales for you today, and they have to do with hyperdimensionality. Now that's a mouthful, so we need a little introduction here. What is hyperdimensionality, right? It's a composite word. It's hyper and dimensionality, which alludes to dimensions. We live in what is apparently a world of 3 dimensions, which means that every point in space can be specified by 3 different coordinates. For instance, the horizontal coordinate, the vertical coordinate, and the depth coordinate, or longitude, latitude, and height, or left and right, up and down, back and forth. There are many ways to frame these 3 dimensions, but you end up always with 3 coordinates to specify any point in space. And with these points, we can describe every object and every phenomenon in the world around us with these 3 dimensions. Now, when we say that an object or a phenomenon is hyperdimensional, what it means is that it requires more than these 3 dimensions in order to be described and explained. It entails a complexity that doesn't fit into the bottle of 3 dimensions, if you will. It spills over. There is stuff left out if we try to squeeze it into 3 dimensions. So that's basically what the word means. The difficulty, of course, is in visualizing spatially anything beyond 3 dimensions. If there are more than 3 dimensions, they are invisible to us, but not only that, they are nearly impossible to imagine, to visualize, to form a picture in our heads about what it could mean for an object to have 4, 5, 6, 7 dimensions. We can't visualize that. And yet, I have 2 little tales today, 2 little myths that are based on this idea of hyperdimensionality. Now let's start with our first tale, our first myth, and it is the following. Modern physics seems to require more than the 3 dimensions of space that we normally perceive in order to explain the structure and behavior of matter. Modern theories like several versions of string theory and M theory require up to 10 dimensions of space. Now that's mind-boggling because we can't see these other 7 dimensions. We can only perceive and imagine 3. Yet the complexity of the phenomena we observe in laboratories is such that we can't squeeze that into 3 dimensions. So we have to work with up to 10 dimensions in our mathematical models. Luckily, mathematics doesn't require that we are able to visualize everything in space. We can write down the equations for 10 dimensions just as easily as we can write down equations for 3 dimensions. But the implication, if these theories are correct, is of course that these extra 7 dimensions that would then span a hyperdimensional space of 10 dimensions, 10 coordinates, out of which we only see 3, these extra 7 dimensions would actually exist. They would be out there right now, all around us. It's just that we don't see them. That is the implication of these theories. And another implication is that matter, the subatomic particles that form the atoms, molecules, tissues, organs, your body in itself, that matter exists fundamentally in these 10 dimensions. That's where it resides. So the body of the people you see around you, their bodies, although you only see 3 dimensions, those bodies walking around in your own body fundamentally exist in 10. So there is a lot of your body, of other people's bodies, that you're not seeing because they are in these invisible dimensions. Now, one thing that we tend to assume implicitly is that every element of this hyperdimensional body that our bodies probably truly are, every element in those 10 dimensions is visible in some way in the 3-dimensional projection that we see. But that is not necessarily the case if you think about it. You see, suppose that you take a picture of yourself head on, a picture of your face head on. Now, that is a two-dimensional projection of your three-dimensional face. The picture only has two dimensions, left and right, up and down. It's a flattened projection of something that exists fundamentally in three dimensions. Now, suppose that, say, you have a mole on the side of your neck and you take this picture head on. That mole will not appear in the picture, right? The picture, the projection in two dimensions of three-dimensional information of your head in three dimensions, information will be lost in that two-dimensional projection, and you will not see the mole. It will not be captured in that dimension because it's on the side of your neck. Anything on the side of your neck, on the side of your head, will not be visible in the two-dimensional projection of the photo. Now, imagine how much information can actually get lost in a projection from 10 dimensions to 3. You see, we lose a lot of information in a flat picture compared to how our bodies actually look. If you walk around the body and observe a body, a lot of that gets lost if you just take a flat picture. Imagine how much gets lost from 10 to 3 dimensions. And not only that, some of what gets lost may not even be hinted at in the projection that remains. To return to the example of the picture, information about your nose gets lost, but you still see a nose, a flattened nose in the picture. But the mole on the side of your neck is completely lost. By looking at the picture, you would never have guessed that there was a mole there to begin with. So the myth here is that our bodies may entail structures in this hyperdimensional space of 10 dimensions, of which not a hint is preserved in the three-dimensional image that we can actually experience and see. There may be organs, organ systems, fundamental structures inherent to what it means to be a human body that are not visible at all, that are not hinted at all in this three-dimensional projection that we see. It's very hard to dismiss this possibility out of hand. Of course, it's a myth in the sense that there is no reason to believe it, but we can't really dismiss it out of hand. One way potentially to dismiss this is if one day science would advance to a point that we could explain the human body and human functioning, human physiology entirely without appealing to any invisible structure in these other 7 dimensions. You see, if we had a closed causal explanation for the inner workings of the human body, complete, explaining everything, then you could say we don't need to postulate any invisible hyperdimensional structure because what we can see already accounts for all the observations. That would be true, but we don't have that closed causal explanation. It's not there. There is so much we don't understand of the molecular details of human physiology. There are so many mysteries left. We do not have a closed causal explanation of the human body on the basis of what we see in 3 dimensions. So there again, we cannot dismiss this myth out of hand. It is a myth, but it can't be dismissed out of hand. That's what makes this myth interesting, I think. Now, another thing that I wanted to share and just brainstorm about, another element of this myth, is the following. There are parts of our body that grow and eventually get discarded. For instance, our nails grow and we cut them and we discard the pieces that we cut. Our hair grows and we cut our hair and we discard the pieces that are cut away. Our skin grows constantly from the inside out, so it flakes every day. We lose the outer layer of our skins every day, and actually that's the main component of the dust in our houses. But we don't sit around sad because the outer layer of our skin has died and been discarded, because the core element of the body remains. It is not under risk because we've lost skin, pieces of nail, and hair. Now, if our body actually is a hyperdimensional structure in 10 dimensions, the myth, the idea, is that the part that we see is in some way analogous to the skin that grows and gets discarded. The visible body grows throughout a lifetime, gets older, and is eventually discarded. But maybe the core of the structure of the body, existing in those invisible 7 dimensions, stays, just like the root of your garden plants stay alive throughout the winter even though the visible part dies. Maybe the core of what it means to be us, for what it means to have a human body, stays even when the visible part detaches, decomposes, and is discarded. That is the first myth. So now the second tale of today. It's also a hyperdimensional tale, but here hyperdimensionality is used in a more metaphorical way and not a literal way like the previous myth. It is the following. It is an accepted notion in mainstream neuroscience today that our subjective reality, the world we live in, is actually a brain-constructed hallucination. The same neuronal mechanisms underlying our dreams are also responsible for generating our experience of waking reality. The difference being that supposedly this waking hallucination that we call reality is modulated by external electromagnetic signals that come from an external world independent of mind. But it's a brain-constructed hallucination nonetheless. Now, think about this. If everything we experience, including scientists, is a product of this brain-constructed hallucination, then we have to question the nature of what we know about the brain itself. You see, what we call the brain, all the anatomy we have studied, all the measurements we have made, all the models we have constructed about what a human brain is and how it works, these were all derived from observations made within the reality constructed by the brain. So there is a self-referential loop in this whole thing. So the second myth is the following. The brain-constructed reality we live in is actually not complete, and it doesn't capture everything that actually exists. It's a limited copy, maybe even distorted copy of what is really going on. Therefore, what we call the brain, being limited by this copied reality that I just referred to, is not the brain. It's just a projection of the real brain, which we might call the hyperbrain, onto the reality constructed by the hyperbrain. In other words, the brain is an image, a projection of the hyperbrain within the reality constructed by the hyperbrain. Everything we know about the hyperbrain is an inference based on the brain, which is this limited projection. You see what I mean? This may sound far out, but it's actually quite reasonable. We have no reason to believe that a brain-constructed copy of reality is complete. Therefore, we have no reason to believe that what we see, measure, and understand about the brain is complete either. What we call a brain may be just like a flat photograph of a structure that exists in many more dimensions, in a reality that transcends what we normally call consensus reality. And then the next question, the implication of this little fantasy, is what is this hyperbrain? Where does it exist? What is the reality where it fundamentally is anchored, where it lies? And what happens to it when the brain, its lower dimensional projection, if you will, in a metaphorical way, decomposes? Could the brain that we normally see in our lives, that we understand, be just an echo of something, a structure that fundamentally transcends what we call reality, because it is the generator of this reality? And could that hyperbrain that transcends reality and creates it endures and persists even after its image, its echo within the world it has constructed, fades away like a brain dying and decomposing?